Hey guys, so today I thought what I would do is look at some of the most commonly Googled photography terms and help out anyone who's starting out in photography to kind of understand what those things mean when they see or hear them. So I'm just going to scroll through my list and kind of go over some of these terms. So let's see. First one is aperture. So aperture is how much or how little light you're allowing into your camera. So your aperture is your f-stop. So if it's really low, like 1.8 for example, you're letting lots of light into your camera. If it's really high, like 11, 22, you're not letting very much light into your camera. So the next term on my list is bokeh or bokeh. You may also hear these referred to as bokeh balls. That's essentially how blurry your background is. If you get a nice blurry background, then everything kind of melts away and you don't really see what's there anymore. It's just color. So especially if you're photographing lights, if you have a lot of blurry background lights, they'll turn into these little balls in the background, and that's where that term comes from. So if you hear comments like that nice bokeh, that's how nice and blurry the background of an image is. Okay, so the next term on my list is chromatic aberration. So that just means that you have some colored bits around the edges. So if you see an image and it has a bit of magenta kind of around the edges of a subject, or let's say you're taking photos of a tree in the winter time and you see those branches, if they have some magenta or green or whatever color around the edges, that's chromatic aberration. Okay, next term on my list is composition. That's essentially just how you lay out your image, and there's a lot of different ways you can compose an image. There's really no right or wrong way. There's different rules, like the rule of thirds, where you try to break up your frame into thirds and use those to your advantage. So there's a lot of different ways to compose an image, and everyone has different preferences, but it's just how your image is laid out. Oh my gosh, I hear a train. Okay, so next one is crop factor. So depending on what camera you're using, if it's a full frame camera or a crop camera, you'll have a different crop factor. So it only really matters if you're worried about what lens you want to use. If you want, let's say, a 24mm lens, if you're using it on a crop sensor camera, it is not going to be 24mm. If your crop factor is 1.5, you're going to end up with a 36mm lens instead of 24. If you're using a full frame sensor, then it doesn't have a crop factor and you will be using the 24mm. Okay, next one is depth of field. So if you have a very shallow depth of field, it just means that only a tiny bit of your image is in focus and the rest of it is blurry or out of focus. If you have a wider depth of field, then that essentially means everything in the image is in focus. Okay, so next one is distortion. You can probably see this one the most if you're photographing something like a building that's really tall with straight lines. If you take a photo of it, you'll notice that those lines aren't straight, they actually start to curve. So that's something you can fix afterwards, but distortion just means that the lines in your image are not straight and they have been distorted. Okay, so the next term is exposure, and this one's an interesting one because it can actually be used in more than just one way. So the first kind of meaning of exposure is just how light or dark your image is. So if it's nicely exposed, that means there's no spots that are so bright that they've been blown out or gone completely white, and there are no spots that are so dark that they're completely black. So it's nice in the middle and you can see everything. So exposure you could also use as a term when you are talking about a long exposure versus a shorter exposure image. So if, let's say, you're photographing a waterfall and you want the water to look like it's moving, you'll hear people say they're doing a long exposure. So that just means they're leaving the shutter speed open in order to capture that. So exposure kind of depends on how it's being used and what context it's in. So you can talk about your exposure as being overexposed, underexposed, or perfectly exposed. So the next term is exposure compensation. So if you're dealing with all your own settings, but you want the camera to automatically underexpose or automatically overexpose to a certain degree, you can set that up right on your camera. That way, if you're worried about overexposing, you can always set it to underexpose every single image, and that way you can kind of compensate for any errors you might make in overexposing your image. Just a quick note on exposure as well. If you're processing your images afterwards, it is so much easier to bring up the shadows of an underexposed image, but difficult, if not impossible, to bring down the brights in an image. So I would err on the side of underexposing or making your image a little bit darker every time. I would try as best as you can not to make your photo too bright, because it's really difficult, if impossible, to recover from that. If you're just starting out, you might want to use exposure compensation and have it underexpose a little bit every single time, just to make sure that you're still in that range where you can edit afterwards and it looks great. Okay, so next term are filters. So what the heck is a filter? A filter is something that you just screw on to the end of your lens. There's different types of filters. I personally love filters for one super big reason, and that is if you happen to drop your lens or bang your lens or something, if it cracks or breaks, if you have a filter on, hopefully it only cracks or breaks your filter and not the actual lens. So filters are great. You can get UV filters, polarizing filters, and something called a neutral density filter, and that's kind of like sunglasses for your lens. So you can get all different types of filters, but if you're just starting out, you don't have to spend a ton of money on them. Just get something to put in front of that glass to make sure you keep the lens safe. So next one is focal length, and focal length is measured in millimeters, and you'll see it on your lens what focal length you're at. So if you have a normal kit lens, I think those are usually about 18 millimeters to 55 millimeters, or you can get prime lenses which have one fixed focal length. So if you have a prime lens, let's say you have a 50 millimeter lens, that means that lens will not zoom in or out. If you want to zoom in or out, you'll have to physically move back and forth. So next term is HDR, or high dynamic range. So in this case, you would take 2 or more images of different levels of exposure. So you can capture the highlights, shadows, and midtones and combine them all into one image. So all of those things are perfectly exposed and everywhere is nice and vibrant and contrasty. And that's what an HDR image is. So next term on here is ISO. Now your ISO setting on your camera is pretty important. That's how sensitive your camera is to light. So if it's a really bright day outside, you might want your ISO to be a little bit on the lower side, 100, 200. If you're indoors, you might want it to be a little bit higher, 400, 800, and if you're in a really low light situation, you might have to push it higher than that. So if you push your ISO really high, then you're going to get to one of these other terms, and that is grain or noise. So if you have really high ISO, you'll start to see your image look a little bit staticky, and that is called either grain or noise. So if you have a really noisy image, you might have to reduce that ISO to get a better image. Some people like having grainy images, some don't. It's a matter of preference. Okay, next term is lens flare. So if you are out photographing and you have the sun in your image and you see a streak of light, little bubbles of light throughout your image, that's a lens flare from the sun. You can also get a lens hood or use a lens hood if you have one, in order to block that out, or you can always just use your hand to block it out. If you really like having it in your image, then use it, go for it. So next term is vignetting. This can happen naturally, or some people add it to images afterwards. That is essentially where the 4 corners of your images, you start to see a bit of a darkening around the corners. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this has been informative. Please like this video and subscribe to this channel for more photography content.